Hi everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Had a nice week so far. So just to give a quick introduction whilst we've got everyone on, appreciate there might be some more people joining in a moment. So to let everyone know, myself and Jerry, we're two of the sales executives here. So we work on sort of that team. And then we've got Steve, who's our resident compliance expert, our Cognisys COO, sits on the product advisory board over at Banter. Has got a long-lasting career within the space. So before we kind of pass over into the questions, I'm sure there'll be plenty from everyone on the call to understand a bit more about the framework. I'm just going to start off giving a very quick introduction to who Cognisys are, in case anyone isn't aware of us, and to give you a bit of understanding of some of the work that we do. Perfect. So very quickly to kind of go into who we are and where we started. So we were founded back in 2019 as a pen testing organization. We are a CREST registered company, and our CTO sits on the board over at CREST and helps prepare some of the exams for CREST. So from that standpoint, really competent. And as we've blossomed and grown, we've moved into the compliance governance risk area. So now obviously from the GRC piece, we work directly through helping customers with different frameworks and likes of ISO 27001, SOC 2, and obviously, as we're all here to talk about today, DORA, which is more of a recent, obviously, framework which should be on people's mind and people are looking to address. So to go into a bit more detail on that, I'm going to ask Steve a couple of questions. We'll go from there. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to register into the chat, go for that, and we'll be able to kind of crack on from addressing any points that people want to make note of, and move on through there. Perfect. So I think a starting question from me, Steve, it'd be a good place to start with who's actually affected by DORA. I know from some conversations it's been difficult to know. Potentially, obviously, if you're inside the UK, how does that maybe affect you? Obviously EU-based, but yeah, a bit of information around who it's affecting and what organisations are going to be regulatory scoped.
Cool. Yeah, sure. Happy to dive right in there. Yeah. So DORA, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, right, is European legislation. So by that nature of us, or the UK having left the European Union now, it doesn't necessarily apply as law in the UK, but it does apply to all financial institutions in the EU. So any UK business providing a financial service into the EU falls under the requirements and needs to comply with DORA, but then also any IT business. So this is the other part of it, right? So any UK-based business providing IT services to any European-based financial entities have to comply with DORA as well. So it's not just financial entities. So there's been a lot of communication and emphasis on those financial services providers, banks, insurers, cryptocurrency businesses, anyone needing financial licenses, banking licenses, etc. It applies to all of those groups, but it also goes a step further and it applies to the IT service providers of those companies as well. So if you're providing any critical IT infrastructure, any core applications, anything, the DORA refers to ICT services in quite a broad sense. So if you're providing any of those IT services, it applies.
Amazing, perfect. Thank you for that. So moving on then, what are the primary sort of compliance frame requirements under DORA for obviously info security, incident response, incident reporting, and operational resilience as well?
Yeah, so DORA as a whole, right? So if we look at what they tried to do at DORA, the objective of DORA is to strengthen the digital operational resiliency of financial institutions, right? So given the cybersecurity risks we face globally, and the challenges, data breaches, security incidents, the impacts they have. Just look at what happened, to sort of international travel at airports when CrowdStrike went down, right? So in order to try and limit that from a financial perspective, or in terms of the financial space in Europe, right, the EU came up with DORA, and the objectives to strengthen the operational resiliency of financial entities, right? And part of that is then their third-party critical suppliers and IT suppliers as well. So how they've done that, they've broken it down into a few key requirements, right? So it covers resilience testing, incident reporting, your ICT risk management processes. That goes into third-party risk assessment, so that vendor risk management, vendor assessment piece comes into play in a big sense. It also forces or is pushing companies into identifying critical functions. So it's something that, bigger financial entities cover generally within their governance frameworks, because they're broader, they're bigger, they have more resources, right? So they've got more established governance functions. But in the smaller business space, we don't really see those smaller businesses clearly identifying what those critical functions are and the impact of those critical functions on their business. So that's a key requirement as well. There are strict requirements on how ICT cybersecurity risks are managed. So the framework by which you're managing those risks, the processes around those, and then the detecting and reporting of anomalous activities, right? So one of the areas or one of the requirements of DORA is that businesses report on incidents. It's one of the areas where there's still a lot of uncertainty, because it's quite broad. If we simply read the DORA documentation that's been published, but yeah, there is a requirement for those entities to report on all incidents. Yeah.
Perfect. So another question that I'd asked for was, what are the key differences between DORA and other regulations such as GDPR or NIST directive, and how should organizations actually prioritize DORA in conjunction with those regulations?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. There are so many compliance frameworks globally now, right? So if we go back to the core staples, traditionally we've got ISO 27001 in Europe, EMEA. The US has SOC 2 as their staples, but we're just seeing that roll out further and further, and more frameworks, more requirements. DORA is one. We have Cyber Essentials in the UK. There's the NIST frameworks, there's the state ramps and FedRAMP equivalents in the USA. We have the EU AI Act. So there's so many requirements coming out on top of all the financial regulatory requirements. They're just growing, but there's a lot of commonality, right? At the core of any governance framework, not just cybersecurity specific, financial frameworks as well, is risk management. So again, what are those risk management processes that an organization has? How effective are they? How well are they being implemented? Gone are the days where you can simply have a 2-page risk management policy and a basic Excel spreadsheet that you look at once a year. No, they want companies to really think about those risk management processes, who's owning them, who's managing them, what are the processes for managing that, and how effectively are they actually being implemented in businesses. So yeah, DORA is one of a whole range of regulatory and requirements frameworks that now apply to organizations, but there is a lot of commonality across those. Incident management is also a core requirement of ISO 27001, of SOC 2, etc., and it's core to DORA as well. So yes, although DORA is its own set of regulations, there are businesses will have a lot of existing processes that will form a good base for meeting the DORA requirements. Some of those need to be expanded on, and sort of adapted to specifically address DORA, but they do form a foundation. And so it's not a matter of starting from zero in most cases.
Steve, I just have a couple of questions into the chat there. First one's from Rob. Does provide services to clients in Europe cover alternative assets investment companies, for example, where they don't deal with B2C but only B2B?
Yes. If you are providing any IT services to a business that falls into that space of being a financial organization, I just want to go up in my notes here because it's sort of I've got a few, right? So DORA specifically refers to financial entities, and it sort of gives a whole list of those. So, financial entities are quite broad. People like banks, insurance companies, investment firms, payment service providers, crypto asset providers, transaction processing businesses, right? It applies to all those businesses, and it also applies to any of their third-party providers offering IT services, right? So it's cloud providers, it's software services, and it's anyone who provides a crucial role in their ICT and financial ecosystem. So even if it's a service provider, right? If you're a managed service provider based in the UK and you're managing core infrastructure for an EU-based financial services providing business, you also need to apply because your client will need to ensure that you meet the requirements through their supplier due diligence processes on their end. So yes, it's quite vague, Rob. There is still a lot of uncertainty. We're still uncertain what the enforcement mechanisms are going to look like, who's going to be responsible for enforcing these things. Same thing happened with GDPR all those years ago, right? We now have in the UK the ICO is well established, but they weren't in the beginning. So we have the regulation, but we haven't yet got all the details on how it's going to be enforced in the various geographic regions. So there's probably a bit of leeway there, but yes, it does apply if you're providing services to financial entities, and it doesn't distinguish whether it's a B2C or B2B. It just simply refers to financial entities.
Do UK financial organizations need to comply with DORA without a significant presence or business in Europe?
No, if you're a UK-based financial service provider or financial services business with no European client base and no intention to have a European client base, then no, you do not need to comply with DORA.
Brilliant. And another one from Jagan. We are an IT product organization. The products are installed in customers' data centers and managed by them. We do not have access to the customer environments. In this case, what is applicable to us in respect to DORA?
That's a great question. That's probably going to fall into the gray space given what we understand at the moment. So gray space, you're probably better off having a look at what the requirements of DORA are and aligning with them. Here's one of the key requirements of DORA, and this is where it would apply specifically in that area, right? I just want to pull it up here in my notes because I've actually given a nice summary of it, right? So it says, so financial entities, right? So those organizations to whom DORA applies and who need to comply with DORA, right? They must document their ICT risk management framework. They must document their resilience policies and their processes for how they're going to prove that they're doing effective resilience testing, right? Incident response needs to be documented and evidence needs to be provided that you're actually implementing and testing those. And then third-party risk assessments, you actually need to report and be able to produce evidence on how regularly you conduct vendor risk assessments, what the risk profile of your vendors are, their resilience status, okay, any incidents, Okay, and so all of that's going to be reported by your client. So if you're providing a service like that or software, you are a vendor to that organization will have to include you in their vendor management processes, and they would need to report on it. So your client would want to or would need to have an understanding of how compliant you are.
Perfect. And I think, Samir, that answers your question as well. It's very similar. This one from Gary: did I read somewhere that DORA wouldn't be applicable to sub 50 users and staff, regardless of the type of financial entity?
Yeah, so we're getting into sort of, you know, the gray space a little bit more, right? So DORA does, let me refer to the actual framework, right? So DORA does provide a streamlined approach. Okay, and that streamlined approach refers specifically to ICT risk management. So there are some shortcuts in DORA, right? And it refers to smaller and less complex businesses. So there is an assumption that's been made, and people have attached this less than 50 employees or below 10 million euro. That has not been confirmed 100%, right? That is the industry making an assumption for how do we measure smaller and less complex. Okay, the framework or DORA itself, the actual regulation, speaks about smaller and less complex organizations. Okay, so that less than 50, sort of micro, small, less than 10 million euro, might, you know, those might be the boundaries. Again, this stuff will probably be established over time, but it's not yet been clearly defined at the moment, right? However, in those cases, it does not say it's not applicable. It allows you to take a simplified approach to meeting the requirements of DORA. And what does that simplified approach cover? Well, there is a tailored or a simplified approach to risk management requirements. Okay, so you're allowed to adopt a less intense risk management framework. Probably a better way to phrase that is a proportionate risk management framework. Okay, there's reduced reporting obligations, so the requirements on reporting are reduced, not removed, just reduced. Okay, again, the requirements for those smaller, less complex organizations around resilience testing, right? So that business continuity, incident response, penetration testing, and vulnerability management pieces, right? Again, it's simplified, not removed. Okay, simplified incident management processes, again, simplified, not removed. And there is more flexibility around your third party and supplier vendor risk management processes. Okay, so you still need to manage that piece. You still need to document who your critical vendors are. You still need to conduct risk assessments. You need to have a process for analyzing and assessing, right, the risk of your vendors. But again, it's a simplified, more flexible approach. Okay, it's worth adding at that point, right, that DORA's enforcement measures are proportional, right? So when they've established what the enforcement mechanisms are going to look like and who's going to police it, right, it is going to be proportional. The enforcement is going to be proportional. So, you know, a small software business or a small tech business of 30 or 40 employees is not going to be held to the same standard as a high street major European bank. Yeah, so yes, there is, you know, to get right back to the question, there is a simplified approach for smaller organizations. It does not remove the requirement to be compliant. It just provides a simplified approach. And that assumption of less than 50, less than 10 million euro turnover is not defined. It's an industry assumption.
Amazing. One from Dale here. We are an FCA company based in the UK. We have a Spanish CNMV registered business. Does the UK business need to be DORA compliant, or is it just for the Spanish entity?
It's probably going to come down to how the contractual agreements between those two organizations have been drawn up. The simplified approach there would be for the Spanish business to contract and treat the European or the UK business as a supplier. The Spanish business will need to be compliant, and the Spanish business will need to risk assess and manage the UK supplier in line with their DORA processes and requirements. Yeah, so the UK business itself won't have to be compliant, but they still would need to comply with the risk, the third-party risk assessment and risk management processes of the Spanish organization.
We've one from Michael. We provide market charting data and widgets for banks. Is it not critical services? Shall we worry about DORA?
Yeah, great question, Michael. DORA does refer to critical services, right? So there are, specific references to organizations identifying their critical services, and then clearly states, there needs to be a process to effectively mitigate those risks and manage those risks. Although it doesn't negate the need for businesses who aren't critical to not be compliant. Okay, so if you're a UK-based business, Michael, you probably wouldn't have to worry about, proving you're fully DORA compliant. Again, expect to see your clients pushing those vendor due diligence, vendor risk management processes onto you to establish, their risk profile from their end. So expect to see, additional vendor security questionnaires, audit pieces coming through from their end. So yeah, I would suggest you're still familiar with what the requirements are, so that it allows you to better respond to those clients, but that it doesn't. They still need to manage your business the same. They will have a defined vendor risk management piece and processes. They would need to follow that, and you would need to be part of that.
Amazing. We've probably touched a small bit on this one, but for banks with small number of customers, so corporate less than.
Sorry, Jerry. I see Michael's just saying. Not sure I got it. Yeah. So, Michael, bank goes to you asking for DORA compliance. Can you answer that we are not a critical service? No, because it is the bank's decision to define if you're a critical service or not. So, if your banking client categorizes you as a critical service, they need to then deal with that in line with their process, and they would then need to treat you as a critical service provider. If you're simply providing widgets, have the conversation with them, but it's their decision. They would need to define the processes and the methodology they have in place for defining critical. And if you happen to be designated as critical in their processes, they will then push those requirements onto you. So from a regulatory perspective, they might not, you don't have to meet the requirements, but if your banking clients are saying you need to be compliant, then you will need to ensure that, you implement the requirements so that you can evidence compliance to meet their needs. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Perfect. Yeah, so back to just the chat for a bank with small number of customers, so corporate less than 100, or individuals less than 500 based in Europe. However, the banks operate purely in the UK. Does it call for DORA compliance?
If you're a financial entity and you're registered in the European Union, yes, you need to be compliant, irrespective of where your clients are based. There isn't a delineation based on who your clients are or where they are based geographically. It simply refers to all Europeans. So if you are a business in Europe, if you are regulated by any financial authorities in Europe, or work in any of those regulated financial spaces, yes, provide insurance services. So let's say, for instance, you're an insurance business based in Paris, but you only sell insurance services to UK businesses. You are still an insurance business registered in Paris. You still need to comply with the requirements.
Amazing. And we have Michael here again. What would an estimate risks for non-compliance? Are any figures I can refer to, like GDPR penalties? Has that been defined?
Yeah, great question, Michael. No, the penalties have not been defined, certainly not in financial values. The only thing we understand is that there is a proportional enforcement measures, right? So the whatever those enforcement measures are, they will be proportional. So I'm assuming there will be based, it'll be a percentage based on turnover or things like that. It would work. I can imagine it's going to work very similarly to GDPR. What we also need to remember, right, is it took a very long time after GDPR became mandatory for organizations like the ICO, right, and the European equivalents, okay, so the EDPS, to actually define, what those penalty structures are going to look like, and then to go a step further to actually, pursue organizations for failures. It took a long time. I don't think the ICO issued fines for many years, at least 5 years, probably closer to 10, more like it. So yeah, it's going to take a while for those enforcement mechanisms to come into play. I don't think it's going to take as long as GDPR. I think they'll get onto it a bit quicker, but we don't have the specifics in terms of numbers and percentages yet. Certainly not that I've seen.
Super. Guys, keep it coming. Keep the questions coming into the chat. We'll get back to them whenever more comes up. But for now, Jordan, I can hand it back to yourself to answer Steve a few more questions that might be top of mind.
Yeah, definitely. So a question I actually got asked, which was sort of similar to, I suppose, the answer, or based on what Steve gave there, was what are the actual types of incidents that are going to need to be reported on DORA, and what those timelines look like for reporting them back to the regulatory authorities?
Yeah, great question. A great question. So again, they've not been super specific on what that looks like. So a large portion of that's going to come down to how organizations define incidents themselves. Okay, the criteria for defining and designating an incident as an incident differs from business to business. We just have to look at like ISO 27001 SOC 2 in the industry and how various organizations have different approaches to defining that alone, right? So we're going to have the same here. What do you define as an incident, and to whom you need to report it? Okay, so yeah, we need to understand, and it's still being defined who incidents have to be reported to. And I think once they've defined to whom these incidents need to be reported, we'll start getting indications of timelines around reporting. I just want to pull up here because it does state, right? So where did we go to for that? Here, so the reporting. So yeah, so DORA itself mandates the reporting of ICT incidents. Okay, and it refers to this incidents that could affect financial stability, disrupt services, or compromise data integrity, right? So I mean, that's like as vague as it can get, because any incident has the potential to impact financial stability, disrupt services, or compromise data integrity, right? So I think disrupting of services is probably a big one, and compromising data integrity there. And then it states It refers to organizations being required to notify authorities as soon as possible, typically within hours, more than days, is where we're leaning towards. Okay, again, a lot of the organizations in the financial space will have other regulatory requirements already. So those with banking licenses have defined obligations. Those cryptocurrency organizations are also now being forced to get banking licenses. Any financially regulated organizations, those regulatory bodies have quite defined or really well-defined processes and mechanisms for reporting various incidents. And so what we can see is an extension of that to the same organizations, the same regulatory bodies, etc. Yeah.
Cool. So another one here would be around digital resilience testing. So what are those expectations? How frequently should people be conducting these tests?
Yeah, so this is my pet hobby, right? So we all know, or we all have seen organizations who do a once-a-year tabletop exercise for ISO and SOC. We need to expand on that. That's not going to be good enough for DORA. Okay, so if we get into it, right, what's covered under resilience testing, right? So resilience testing is going to cover your incident response, your business continuity. It's going to enforce or require businesses to up the game in terms of vulnerability management and to carry out penetration testing that is proportionate. Okay, so as a penetration testing organization ourselves, we have a lot of businesses who come to us and ask us to do, the bare minimum penetration testing. I need to tick the box. I need to say I've done it. I need a report. I need it to be carried out by a accredited penetration testing firm, and that's about it. Right. So what's the minimum we can do? Because I need a report to use. That's not going to cut it either. Right. So DORA is quite clear. It mandates regular testing. Okay. And that testing needs to be proportionate, and it needs to ensure resilience against cyber threats. Okay. The range of testing, so we've been through vulnerability management, penetration testing, scenario-based simulations of disrupting, so that incident response business continuity tabletop exercising is going to have to be greatly improved upon. Okay. And testing needs to be regular, and it needs to be proportionate. If you're a big bank and you're releasing updates to a range of products, right, web apps, mobile applications, internal services, if you're releasing updates on a weekly basis, you're not going to be able to justify to any regulatory authority or industry body that doing a penetration test once a year is sufficient. Right. And so that resilience testing is going to have to fall in line with your sort of organization and operational processes from a risk perspective. How often are you making updates? How often are you changing things, etc. So that's going to play a massive part in this. And again, I don't think there are very few organizations who are getting ahead of the curve there to start defining what those digital operational resiliency testing programs and schedules and approaches are going to look like. We have to look at things like vulnerability management. Again, right, there are too many larger organizations not doing effective vulnerability management, right? Having a scan done once a quarter, not going to cut it either, right? Software applications are being updated on a daily basis. So yeah, you're going to need to, what it boils down to is that every organization is going to need to define what their approach to it is. Right, so we're going to start seeing DORA policies and plans, digital operational resiliency testing plans and policies, and then we're going to need to see them being implemented more effectively across the organization. Again, taking an infosec manager or a compliance manager and one or two other people in the business into a room for an hour to write up a tabletop exercise report, it's not going to cut it either. We need to be involving the people involved in actually dealing with incidents, our infrastructure teams, our engineering teams, our security teams, our the teams responsible for communicating with clients, our legal teams, who's responsible for reporting the incidents. We're going to need to see a massive shift in gears, right, around that tabletop incident response business continuity testing as well.
Amazing. I mean, one of the other questions I had, which is you sort of touched on it there and potentially answered parts of it as well, is more around actual specific documentation. So on the reporting structures you mentioned, obviously mandated by DORA, particularly around risk management and obviously the operational resilience you mentioned there. What are those documentation? What does it look like, and what should people be, I suppose, preparing to put in place?
Yeah. The starting point for any business should be what they have in place already, so those security management systems, those ISMSs, the policies, procedures, risk management processes, that exist in a business, evaluating what you have, comparing those with the requirements of DORA, and then defining what the gaps are, and then an approach to how those gaps are going to be closed, right? Yeah, nothing in DORA is new either, right? That's worth adding. There's no new requirement. DORA has not come out and said you need to penetration test, and the whole industry's gone, well, it's penetration testing, we've never done it. DORA is actually just trying to enforce controls and control measures that exist already. Okay, penetration testing is not new. Vulnerability management is not new. Tabletop testing for incident response and business continuity are not new. Risk assessments are not new. Vendor risk management, it's not new, right? So none of it's new. They're just trying to get people to up the game slightly. There's also an understanding, right? ISO 27001 is great, but again, the flexibility and scope for you to define your approach is so broad. DORA is saying, actually, do you know what, guys? We're tired of companies taking a bare bones scrape over the bar approach. We need to up our game, and so we need to do better. So have a look at what's in place already. Have a look at the policies, the processes. Again, have a look at those policies and processes for vendor risk management as a whole, security and resiliency testing, right? How well are you actually following and implementing the policies you do have? That's probably a good starting point. All right, go back to what you've documented, and then build on from there.
Just had a question from Mike.
Yeah, sorry, Jordan, you work away there.
No problem. So it was just what's the approx overlap for 27001 controls? Is there anything really new in DORA?
Great question. There is a considerable overlap if your ISMS has been designed well, right? So the actual principles, no, there are no new principles in DORA that aren't covered at all by ISO 27001. Okay, but a lot of ISO 27001 information security management systems are not going to be detailed enough, and so they're going to need to be expanded. Risk management processes are going to have to be expanded. Vendor and supplier management, risk management processes are going to have to be expanded on. Testing, right? Vulnerability testing, penetration testing, tabletop testing. Those processes are going to have to be expanded on as well. Yeah. So no, from my understanding, and from the work we've done to date, we're helping a number of businesses already. With DORA, there isn't anything brand new, but it all depends on how well defined and detailed your ISO 27001 information security management system is. Yeah.
Perfect. And just one here from Gary. Can it be used instead of or to accompany a cybersecurity or risk management framework plan?
Yes. So all these frameworks go quite nicely together, and so if you have other frameworks, right, you might you might align yourself with the NIST cybersecurity framework. You might align your risk management processes with the NIST 800, is it 181 and 53 processes, etc. They're all good accompaniments to DORA. Yeah, they all play quite nicely together. Same as SOC 2, same as ISO, same as NIST 2. Again, there's a considerable overlap with the NIST 2 requirements. Yeah.
Perfect. So for one of the other questions I had, obviously from the chat, guys, if anyone else has any other questions or any other problems that they're kind of dealing with at the minute, please feel free to get them in. As we're sort of approaching towards the back end of the call, it'd be good to get them boxed off for you and make sure you get some more value from this. One of the others from me was around critical third parties. So how does DORA define the critical third parties, and what's the obligations that organizations are going to have regarding that third party risk management?
Yeah. So DORA defines critical third parties as service providers whose services, if they're disrupted, right, could have a significant impact on the financial sector. So within DORA itself, it refers to critical vendors and critical third parties, critical financial service providers, main high street banks, right? And main financial institutions that rely, that we all rely on, that businesses rely on. Typically organizations who will have an impact on the broader stability of a financial the economy and financial environment of geographic regions, countries, cities, etc. They'll all be critical vendors, right? So the language there is, if disrupted, could have a significant impact on the financial sector as a whole, right? And so financial entities must assess and monitor the risk posed by these providers. Okay, and then it goes a step further, right? So something that businesses are going to have to do is they're going to have to update their contracts. Okay, this is a massive piece of work that I think the industry is behind on as a whole, is updating those legal agreements we have in place, right, with our clients, but also with our suppliers that specifically address the resilience requirements that are mandated by DORA. And then DORA goes a step further, and it actually requires that you have a process of continuous monitoring of those relationships. So if you're providing a core infrastructure service to a main high street bank, for instance, right, that bank can't turn around and say, I'm going to send them a questionnaire once a year. They require that it's managed on a continuous basis.
Perfect, thank you for that. From sort of a turning off towards the end of the call now, Steve, is there any sort of lasting notes, anything that you think is worth highlighting?
Yeah, there are a number of there are still a number of uncertainties around DORA, but those uncertainties are all around the enforcement thereof, right? The policing of the requirements. The regulation's been published, we understand what it says, and so we need to take the approach of the spirit of it and try our best. No one's going to moan at you if you don't quite meet the requirements, but you can show you tried, right? And so your interpretation of it. We're also, as an industry, it's going to take us a few years to align on what the requirements are. Think back to when GDPR came out, we were shooting in all different directions to try and show how, or to prove how certain things are implemented and to evidence compliance. And over time, the industry aligned and we figured out what the best and most effective ways to do these things are. Now we have a scenario where, we have GDPR requirements and very well understood, and people understand what the requirements are to implement and meet them. Things like ROPA and data protection impact assessments and data processing agreements and addendums, etc. They're all very well defined. We understand what they are, how they work, etc. And so we will end up in a place like that with DORA, but it's going to take a bit of time. And initially, as we define and work towards that, there is going to be, there's many ways to skin a cat. And so we're going to have different approaches, different organizations taking different routes to get to the same destination.
Thank you for that. I've seen there's no other questions into the Q&A or chat. So just as a wrap up, thank you everyone for hopping on. Obviously, thank you, Steve and Joe, for your time going through. That was really, really insightful. Everyone, we'll pop you over an email. We're trying to get a bit more of a community built around here and understand your feedback. So if you've got any sort of questions or if there's anything you want to ask on the back of that, feel free to come back to our email, give us some feedback, and we'll look at maybe how we can help or discuss going forward. So yeah, thanks everyone for your time. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.